He built an empire from nothing, only to be betrayed by the woman he loved and the man she ran to. But as cancer ravaged his body, he plotted the ultimate revenge, not with rage, but with brilliance. This isn't just a story of betrayal, it's a masterclass in legacy, love lost, and redemption earned. You won't believe how it ends. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that stay with you. The rain was falling in slow, steady sheets over Manhattan, painting the city in glistening silver and shadow. From the back seat of my town car, I watched the lights blur behind streaks on the window, the reflections of wealth and power melting into one another like watercolor. My name is Daniel Kingston, and at 49, I was the name behind Kingston Holdings, one of the largest private empires on the East Coast. If there was a boardroom war to be won, I had already walked away with the spoils. A self-made man, they called me. Relentless, visionary, unshakable. But that night, as the car pulled into the underground garage of Kingston Tower, something in my gut whispered that the world I had built wasn't as solid as I believed. I nodded at Marcus, my driver, and stepped out into the chill without waiting for an umbrella. Let the cold bite a little. It was the only honest thing I'd felt all week. My shoes echoed in the empty marble hallway as I entered the private elevator, its polished metal reflecting back a man in an immaculate gray wool coat, slicked-back hair dusted with silver, jawline hard, eyes harder. But even that reflection didn't feel familiar anymore. Somewhere along the way, the man I thought I was had started to unravel. The elevator opened to the penthouse floor, where the lights automatically warmed the sleek space. Lena wasn't home. No surprise. A note in her delicate handwriting was left on the kitchen island. Charity mixer. Don't wait up. Love, L. That was Lena. Graceful, connected, admired. At 45, she could command attention in a room of heiresses with nothing more than a smile and that effortless old Hollywood glow. We'd met when I was still clawing my way up from a one-bedroom office in Queens, and she had dazzled me then. Still did in her own way. But something had changed over the last year. Her laughter felt rehearsed. Her eyes wandered more often than they met mine. I blamed myself. Long hours, high stakes, the 1,000 tiny cracks in a marriage that success never seems to fill. I shrugged off the coat, loosened my tie, and poured myself 2 fingers of Glenlivet before settling into the quiet hum of my office. On the desk, a stack of quarterly reports waited for my attention. Kingston Holdings was vast. Real estate, biotech, logistics, even digital banking now. Most of the numbers went through my CFO and legal teams before I ever saw them. But tonight, something compelled me to look. Half an hour later, I was frowning. An investment vehicle registered in the Caymans had recorded 5 wire transfers in 2 months, 7 figures each. Cleanly disguised under discretionary expense lines. To the untrained eye, nothing more than aggressive offshore diversification. But to me, hell, I built this system. I knew the signatures weren't mine. My pulse quickened. I opened a secure app on my phone and checked a series of joint accounts. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the list of transactions. $250,000 to a luxury boutique in Milan, a pair of $90,000 payments to a jet charter service, art, jewelry, clothing, things Lena never mentioned, things I never approved, all with her authorization codes. My throat went dry. My phone buzzed. A text. From Lena. Don't wait up, sweetheart. It's turning into a long night. I'll be home in the morning. There was a little heart emoji at the end. It burned like acid. I stared at the message, the glass of scotch suddenly sour on my tongue. Was I being paranoid? Maybe. But then again, I hadn't built a billion-dollar empire by ignoring instinct. Something was wrong. Very wrong. I ran the security feed from earlier that night. Our building used encrypted internal cameras. Most residents didn't even know they were there. I scanned the footage, frame by frame, until I found her, Lena, descending in the elevator, dressed in a backless sapphire gown, hair swept up. She was smiling, vibrant, glowing. Not for me. She was with someone else, a man, younger, confident. His hand pressed low on her back as they stepped into a black car waiting by the curb. The image made my chest tighten. I felt foolish. Weak. I had ignored the signs, dismissed the cold silences, the late nights, the sudden interest in privacy. And now the truth was flashing at me in high definition. I sat back in my chair, heart pounding in my throat. My life, it seemed, had become a fiction. The empire I had worked to protect, the woman I had trusted above all, the love I thought still lived behind those expensive smiles, it was all a mirage. And yet, amid the storm building inside me, a strange sense of calm settled in. The kind that comes right before a decision is made. I would not confront her. Not yet. I would not yell or accuse. Because if Lena had turned on me, if she and this mystery man were playing some long game with my fortune, they wouldn't see me coming. I had built Kingston Holdings with grit and precision, and I could take it all back with the same. I called Sarah, my chief of staff, the one person I trusted without question. She answered on the first ring. "Sarah," I said quietly, "I need you to initiate Protocol Black. Discreetly. Full audit of our top-tier accounts. Also, track all Lena's financials, personal and shared. I want to know every penny she touches." There was a pause on the line, just long enough to feel the weight of what I was asking. Then her voice came, steady and cold. "Understood." As I hung up, the rain outside intensified, hammering the floor-to-ceiling windows. Somewhere in the city, my wife was laughing, toasting to a future I wasn't meant to be part of. But she didn't know I had just declared war. And I wasn't the kind of man who lost twice. I finished my scotch and turned off the lights. In the darkness, I watched the skyline shimmer, each building a monument to power and ambition. Mine. Every inch of it. And if Lena thought she could carve her name into it without a fight, she was about to learn just how dangerous a cornered man could be. The next morning, the city wore a deceptive calm. The rain had stopped, leaving behind wet pavement that sparkled under the sun, as if trying to convince the world nothing had happened overnight. But inside me, something had broken. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a clean, quiet snap, like the last fiber in a worn rope giving way. I stood at the tall windows of my penthouse, coffee cooling in my hand, watching Manhattan stretch awake. People bustled below in neat coats and eager footsteps, oblivious to the fact that their king was no longer at ease in his castle. Lena came home around 7:15 a.m. I didn't confront her. I didn't ask where she'd been. She walked in like she hadn't just stolen from me, lied to me, slipped away into another man's arms just hours earlier. Her hair was perfectly in place. She smelled of rose and musk. A silk shawl slid off her shoulders as she leaned in and kissed my cheek like always, habitual, mechanical. It might have stung if I hadn't already become numb. "Sorry I'm late," she said, her voice breezy. "The mixer went long. Can you believe they auctioned off a signed Warhol print?" "Did you win?" I asked casually, not turning from the window. She laughed. "No, thank God. Can you imagine adding another 5-figure frame to our walls?" I could imagine quite a few things at that point. None of them involved art. As she disappeared down the hall to change, I watched her reflection fade in the glass. She moved like she had nothing to hide, and that unnerved me more than anything. There was no guilt, no flicker of discomfort. Either she was incredibly skilled, or completely convinced I would never catch on. But I had already begun moving pieces behind the curtain. Sarah had sent a message late the night before. Preliminary anomalies confirmed. Full audit in progress. Discretion assured. I had a team reviewing every transaction, every password-protected investment file, every offshore transfer Lena might have made. What I didn't yet know was who the man in the car was, and that mattered. By noon, I was seated in a quiet private dining room on the Upper East Side, across from an old friend, now one of the most ruthless private investigators in New York, Victor Grayson. His graying beard and sharp suit made him look more like a retired senator than the man who once helped me crush a hostile merger by uncovering the CEO's second family in Marseille. "You're not the type to cry over a wandering wife, Dan," he said as the waiter poured our espresso. "So if you called me, this is about more than sex." I nodded once, sliding my phone across the table. On the screen, the still image from the elevator footage, Lena and the man, hand on her back. "She's been draining accounts under Shell LLCs, I said. "She's buying real estate I didn't approve, charter flights, transfers I never signed. I want to know who he is, how they met, and what the hell their plan is." Victor studied the photo, then took a long sip of coffee. "You got a name?" "Not yet." "Then I'll get you one," he said. "But you'd better be ready, Danny. What you're describing, this isn't just betrayal. It's a takeover." That word hit me like a slap. I'd seen plenty of them in the business world. Backdoor deals, proxy wars, sudden boardroom coups. But the idea that my wife might be orchestrating a hostile takeover of my life, that required a level of deception I wasn't ready to admit she was capable of. Back at the tower, Lena was in her studio, the one I had built her when she insisted she wanted to paint more seriously. Oil canvases covered the walls, splashes of color so chaotic they felt like arguments frozen in time. She had always been good at hiding behind abstraction. "How's the work coming?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe. She turned, startled but smiling. "Finally getting somewhere with the textures. Come see?" I walked in, pretending to study the latest piece. Red and black, harsh strokes. Angry. Maybe it was subconscious, or maybe it was a confession in brushstrokes. She stepped closer, her body grazing mine. "It's nice, having you home more. Are you all right?" I nodded, just recentering, thinking about the company's future. She tilted her head, searching my face. "You're not sick, are you? Would it matter if I was?" Her smile faltered just for a heartbeat. Then she laughed softly. "Don't say things like that." But I saw it. Fear. Not of losing me, but of losing whatever future she thought she was securing behind my back. I walked out before I gave too much away. That night, I received Victor's first report. His team had followed Lena from the penthouse to a luxury suite at the Arcadia Hotel on 63rd. She wasn't alone. The man, tall, dark-haired 30-something, was already there, opening the door for her with a champagne bottle in hand. Victor captured everything. The cameras didn't miss a beat. The man's name? Hayden Cole. No legitimate background, several aliases, and ties to a fraud case in Miami that had conveniently vanished a few years back. Con man, professional, and now he was in my bed. The rage that swept over me wasn't fire, it was ice. Cold, calculated, deadly. I wasn't just fighting for my money anymore. I was fighting for every sacrifice I'd ever made, every sleepless night that bought Lena her penthouse studio and her diamonds and her European charity retreats. I had loved her. I had trusted her. And she had turned me into a mark. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I stayed in my study and reread our prenup. Lena had fought hard to keep her name on certain assets, but I had fought harder. The clause buried on page 19 would save me. Any deliberate misappropriation of marital funds, any instance of financial betrayal, would nullify her claim to Kingston Holdings. I had the numbers. I had the surveillance. Now I needed time. The next morning, Lena kissed me goodbye again. I held her hand just a second longer than usual, searching for something. Guilt, shame, regret. But there was nothing. She smiled like everything was fine, like she was exactly where she belonged. "I'll see you tonight," she said. I nodded. "Can't wait." As the door closed behind her, I whispered to the empty room, "Neither can I." She had declared war quietly, but I would end it with thunder. I waited. That's all I did for the next few days. I didn't confront her. I didn't ask about Hayden. I didn't shut down the accounts or freeze the transfers. I didn't send her packing or call a lawyer. I simply waited. And as I waited, I built the trap. Quiet, focused, surgical. Because Lena believed I was still in the dark, and I needed her to believe that a little while longer. She was playing her game, but I had played a longer, bloodier one for decades, and I never lost. Sarah and Victor worked like clockwork. Every account she touched, every receipt, call, text, and reservation she made, they tracked it all. I had Lena's life mapped out with greater accuracy than she probably knew herself, and it was all leading to something. A movement of funds from shell corporations into one master account. An escape plan, no doubt. The real estate purchases? One was a townhouse in Lisbon under an LLC. Another, a yacht being prepped in the Bahamas under Hayden's alias. She wasn't just cheating, she was planning to vanish, with everything. Hayden, it turned out, had done this before. 3 cities, 2 bankrupt heiresses, 1 silent lawsuit buried under NDAs. A confidence man in every sense of the word. Smooth, calculated, utterly soulless. And Lena? Either she was hopelessly in love with him or just desperately clinging to the fantasy that she wasn't aging into irrelevance. Either way, she had picked the wrong man to rob. One afternoon, Lena was lounging on the balcony in a silk robe, flipping through a European property catalog, her glass of wine catching the sunlight like a signal flare. I stepped outside and leaned against the railing beside her. "You ever think of starting over?" I asked casually, eyes on the skyline. She looked up, half smiling. "Starting over? Where would we even go?" "I don't know," I said. "Somewhere warm. Somewhere we don't have to be Daniel and Lena Kingston, power couple, just two people on a beach. She sipped her wine, eyes narrowing thoughtfully. You're getting sentimental. Maybe. I turned to her. But maybe I just missed the version of us that didn't need all this. She didn't answer, just leaned back in the chair and closed her eyes, letting the sun hit her face. I watched her closely, wondering if there was even a flicker of conflict in her. But no, she was far too deep into whatever dream Hayden had promised her. I imagined he told her she could be free, alive again, desirable and dangerous. But what he didn't tell her was that he'd gut her the moment her bank access stopped being useful. 2 nights later, she left again, claiming she had a fundraising dinner at the Met. I didn't question it. I just watched her glide out the door in a black dress that cost more than some people's mortgages, her perfume trailing behind her like a ghost. 5 minutes later, I was in my car, following the location ping Sarah had just forwarded to me. She wasn't at the Met. She was at the Dahlia, a boutique hotel tucked into a quiet corner of Tribeca, known for its privacy and discretion. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. I watched from across the street as Hayden met her in the lobby. He kissed her like he owned her. She laughed like she was 17 again. Then they disappeared into the elevator, leaving me alone in the dark, gripping the steering wheel like it could hold me together. The next morning, I went into the office early. I wasn't sleeping anyway. Sarah had laid out files on my desk. Bank statements, offshore entity charts, flagged transactions. I sat down and studied every page. The total, $38.4 million. That's how much she had moved in 6 months. Not including the assets she'd tried to liquidate behind my back. Not including the trust fund she had quietly redirected into a dummy scholarship foundation that didn't actually fund anything. She was smart. I'd give her that. But she had no idea how much smarter I was when cornered. Sarah stood in the doorway, hesitant. Are you sure you want to go through with this? There's still time to confront her privately. A settlement, damage control. I looked up, my voice calm. No, if I let this happen behind closed doors, she wins the narrative. I want it public. I want it complete. Sarah nodded, understood. That afternoon, I met with my attorneys and initiated the first phase, restructuring the company, pulling my shares from joint holdings, locking down the executive trusts. I made sure it all looked like routine corporate planning, masking the strategic war I was quietly launching. Lena thought she'd drained me, but I hadn't even opened the vault yet. And then came the call that changed everything. Victor rang me late in the evening. His voice was low, tense. You need to come to my office, now. When I arrived, he handed me a folder. Inside were photos. High-resolution surveillance stills. Lena, Hayden, and my junior associate Trevor Lynn, one of the sharpest kids I'd mentored, the one I had personally fast-tracked up the ladder. What am I looking at? I asked, my jaw tight. Victor pointed to a timestamp. This was 3 weeks ago. That's your wife meeting Trevor at the Blue Parlor in Midtown. Twice since then, once without Hayden. Trevor's in on it? Victor nodded grimly. He's been feeding Hayden insider data, timing of deals, shareholder movements, legal gaps. I felt the room tilt slightly. Not just betrayal now. Espionage. They're not just trying to run away with your money, Dan. They're trying to dismantle your empire, bit by bit, and then vanish. I stood silently for a long moment, absorbing the full weight of it. 3 people, all close, all trusted, plotting to take down the thing I'd built with blood, grit, and 30 years of my life. Finally, I breathed in deeply and said the only thing that mattered. Then we make the next move. Victor looked up. You want to go nuclear? I nodded. Total financial lockdown. I want their accounts frozen. I want Lena's name off every document by end of week. And I want Hayden Davis and Trevor Lynn blacklisted in every major firm from Boston to San Francisco. And what about Lena? I turned toward the window, watching the city blink to life below. She's going to learn what it feels like to be stripped of everything. Reputation, status, safety. And when she's down to nothing but the truth, I'll make sure she remembers who gave her the world and who took it back. In that moment, I wasn't grieving. I wasn't even angry. I was awake. And sometimes that's all it takes to bring a kingdom down. The king waking up and deciding not to be merciful. The days that followed blurred into one another. A relentless stream of signatures, encrypted messages, confidential calls, and tight-lipped meetings behind closed doors. No one in the office knew the full scope of what was unfolding, only that Daniel Kingston, usually calm and composed, had taken on a new edge. My eyes were darker, my tone clipped. I wasn't just running a company anymore. I was defending my life's work from the people I once welcomed into my heart. The first strike was silent. Within 48 hours, I severed Lena's access to every joint account. I didn't freeze them outright, that would have tipped her off. Instead, I rerouted the liquidity, restructured the assets under newly formed holding companies, each legally protected, with beneficiaries changed. I even moved the title of the penthouse into the corporate name. From the outside, it looked like a strategic consolidation. From the inside, it was a surgical separation of everything Lena had her hands on. She didn't notice at first. In fact, that Friday, she came home from lunch with her usual glow, holding a small Cartier bag in one hand and her phone in the other. She walked in, laughing into her Bluetooth headset, probably talking to Hayden. I was sitting in the den, sipping espresso, watching the financial news, pretending not to hear her tell someone, "No, he's still clueless." Clueless. I smiled at the word. It was almost cute. She ended the call and turned to me, all sweetness and charm. "Hi, darling. I was thinking we should go upstate next weekend. Just us. We haven't had a retreat in ages." "Sounds perfect," I said, not blinking. "I'll have Sarah arrange everything." That was the moment I saw it, the flicker. A brief flash of doubt in her eyes. She hadn't expected me to agree so easily. Maybe she was testing me. Maybe Hayden had warned her to be careful. But she didn't press. She smiled again and breezed into her dressing room, leaving me alone with the thick silence of betrayal. That night, I received a second report from Victor. Hayden had made a move. He'd wired $1.2 million to a new shell company, Silvergate Maritime Holdings, registered in the Cayman Islands. Within hours, the company had purchased a vessel out of Nassau, not just a yacht, a mobile fortress, fully crewed, untraceable, designed to vanish into the Caribbean with a press of a throttle. They were getting ready to disappear. But what neither Hayden nor Lena knew was that the trust Lena had used to initiate that transfer no longer existed. On paper, sure, it was still active, but I had cloned the trust, redirected it. So while they thought they were moving my money out of the country, they were really funding my counterattack. The yacht? Registered under a dummy shell with a lien I had placed through an offshore creditor. It wouldn't leave port, not with Interpol watching. And then, just as things were starting to turn in my favor, my body betrayed me. It began with a tightness in my chest, a cough that lingered too long. I dismissed it. Stress. Lack of sleep. Then came the shortness of breath and a sudden collapse in the boardroom during a quarterly forecast presentation. One moment I was standing, speaking about diversification across Asia. The next I was staring at the ceiling, a dozen suits blurred above me, shouting my name. I woke up in a private hospital suite, the sterile scent of antiseptic hanging in the air like judgment. Dr. Martinez stood at the foot of my bed, arms crossed. "Mr. Kingston, I won't waste time. You have stage 4 lung cancer. It's aggressive. It's metastasized." I stared at him blankly. "How long?" "With treatment, 6 months. A year if we're lucky." I nodded slowly. No tears, no panic. Just an icy, quiet understanding. My time was now limited. But it was also mine. When Sarah came in, her eyes red-rimmed and filled with worry, I asked her for a phone and my laptop. I didn't want to talk. I wanted to work. "You need to rest," she whispered. "I will," I said. "After I finish this." We worked around the clock from that hospital bed. My room became a war room. Sarah slept in the armchair. My lawyer, Mr. Langston, brought in briefcases full of draft contracts. Victor fed me live updates. I moved millions through silent corridors of international finance, signing over stock options, rerouting charitable trusts, creating legal smokescreens so dense not even Lena could claw her way through them. But I didn't stop there. I left messages, pre-recorded video files, letters dated and time-stamped, instructions to be delivered posthumously, if it came to that. I wasn't just setting traps anymore. I was building a legacy that would survive without me, and at the center of it all was Lena. She still had no idea. She came to visit once, dressed in muted black, eyes shimmering with carefully controlled grief. "I came as soon as I heard," she whispered, sitting beside me, stroking my hand. Why didn't you tell me you were sick? I looked into her eyes and said nothing. I wanted to see if there was a crack, anything that proved she felt more than dread for getting caught. But all I saw was calculation. Don't worry, she said. I'll take care of everything. The board, the foundation, just focus on getting better. I smiled faintly. I trust you. She kissed my forehead. I felt nothing. After she left, Sarah stood at the window, arms folded. She's already calling financial advisors, she said, asking about executive privileges in case of incapacitation. I nodded. Let her think I'm weak. 2 days later, I recorded the final piece, a private message to be played only at the reading of my will. It was short, precise, a reckoning. I named names, showed evidence. Lena, Hayden, Trevor. The siphoned money, the forged records, the secret meetings. And I gave $1 million. Paid over 10 years, just enough to start a new life, or crawl back to one. Sarah watched the final cut with tears in her eyes. Why give her anything, she asked. Because it's not about punishment, I said quietly. It's about control. She nodded slowly. And if you don't make it, then she'll still learn, I said. Everyone will. And with that, I leaned back into the hospital bed, exhausted but finally satisfied. I had done everything I could. I had turned betrayal into strategy, disease into a deadline, and heartbreak into ammunition. Now all that was left was to see how the story ended. The following weeks drifted by like a strange dream, a haze of chemotherapy, boardroom updates, and the hum of machines that kept time with my heartbeat. I couldn't tell whether the nausea came more from the drugs or the thought of what Lena and Hayden were doing while I lay in a hospital bed, thin and graying, looking more like a dying man than the empire builder I once was. But what they didn't know, what no one outside that hospital room knew, was that I wasn't just surviving. I was evolving. The cancer had taken my body, but it hadn't touched my mind. If anything, it sharpened it, made every thought count, made every hour precious. The illusion of immortality had been stripped away, leaving only purpose, and my purpose was crystal clear. This was no longer about revenge, it was about control, justice, and legacy. While Lena played the grieving wife for the board and whispered sweet nothings to Hayden in hotel rooms, I was laying the final foundation of a masterpiece. From behind closed doors, Sarah executed every instruction with the precision of a general. We created new subsidiaries, reallocated shares into irrevocable trusts, and designated successors who had no idea they were about to inherit power. We moved the company's center of gravity away from any place Lena could reach, and she never saw it coming. She, meanwhile, had begun to grow bolder. Sarah reported that Lena was now speaking openly with lawyers about estate control. She had positioned herself as the woman behind the man, the silent strength who had always been in the shadows of Kingston Holdings, ready to take the reins in my absence. I had to hand it to her. She knew how to perform. Grief clung to her like designer perfume. She walked into meetings in all-black ensembles, her eyes red but dry, her voice soft and unshakably composed. "She's working the board hard," Sarah said one morning, handing me her latest report. Whispers of a vote to grant her emergency proxy rights. I nodded, though I barely had the strength to lift my coffee. Let them whisper. I had already neutralized the threat. While Lena chased shadows of authority, the real power had shifted, quietly, irrevocably, to people loyal to me. Men and women whose careers I had shaped, whose debts I had quietly paid. Sarah was the central node in this new architecture. No decision passed without her touch. No whisper escaped her attention. Lena thought she was replacing me. What she didn't know was that I had already replaced myself, with an invisible network, airtight and unbreakable. Victor, meanwhile, had begun the final phase of his own operation. He was tracking Hayden around the clock now. The man was preparing for something. Frequent meetings with a maritime broker, encrypted calls to offshore numbers, even a rumored visit to a private airstrip. Victor's intel confirmed what we suspected. Hayden wasn't just after my money. He was planning an exit. A permanent one. "You think they'll run?" Sarah asked one night, her voice low as we reviewed the latest surveillance photos. Lena and Hayden at a luxury apartment downtown, lips brushing in a dimly lit hallway. "They're not runners," I said, eyes fixed on the image. "They're opportunists. They think they've won. They'll stay just long enough to claim the throne, and then disappear with the crown." "But the crown's already gone," Sarah murmured. I smiled faintly. Exactly. The next morning, I requested a brief meeting with my legal team. Sarah wheeled me into the conference room. The shades were drawn, the lights dimmed. My voice was a ghost of what it had been, but my words were clearer than ever. I want the final trust executed, I told them. The inheritance clause, the restructuring memo, the will, all of it. They exchanged nervous glances. Sir, one of them said carefully, are you sure? Once this is filed, there's no undoing it. I met his eyes. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. That afternoon, I signed the last of the documents. With one stroke of a pen, I rewrote the future of my company, my estate, and Lena's illusions. Then I collapsed. Not from fear, from exhaustion. The weight of everything I'd held together through illness and betrayal and silence finally pressed too hard. I was rushed back to my room, the machines whirring louder, the nurses moving faster, the world narrowing to a tight, pulsing tunnel. I don't remember much from that night, only that it was cold and quiet and filled with flashes of Lena's face, how she looked on our wedding day, how she laughed when we first danced barefoot in that old Parisian apartment we rented long before any of this mattered. But I didn't cry. I wasn't done yet. The next day, the headlines broke. Kingston Holdings under emergency restructure as founder battles illness. Daniel Kingston's will filed, fortune to be divided among foundation and trusted inner circle. It sent shockwaves through every financial corridor from Wall Street to Geneva. Lena didn't see it coming. The empire she thought would fall into her lap had been dismantled brick by brick and rebuilt into something she couldn't touch. Kingston Holdings would now be overseen by a board of legacy appointees, its voting power held by a foundation that bore my name and Sarah's as executive director. My personal fortune? Locked away in social equity funds, scholarships, and startup seed grants for underserved communities. All she got was the letter and the $1 million in monthly installments. The phone in my hospital room rang off the hook. Reporters, lawyers, friends who hadn't called in years. Sarah handled them all. Lena showed up finally. She stood at the foot of my bed, her cheeks pale, her mouth slightly open, as if still waiting for someone to tell her it wasn't real. That it was all a mistake. That the man lying here, tubes in his arms and skin like parchment, hadn't just outplayed her in the most devastating way possible. You planned this, she whispered. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Why, she asked, voice trembling now. You loved me. We were something, I croaked. Once. Tears finally welled in her eyes. I didn't mean, Daniel, I didn't mean for it to get this far. But it did, I said, eyes burning. And now you get to live with it. She opened her mouth again, but Sarah stepped forward, hand on her arm. You need to go. Lena hesitated. One last look, one final chance to say something real. But there was nothing left between us. Not trust, not anger, just silence. She left without another word. When the door closed, I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. Sarah sat beside me, her eyes red. You did it, she said. No, I replied softly. We did it. And we had. We saved everything. Not just the company, but the integrity of what it meant. I would die soon, I knew that now. But I would not die hollow. I had faced betrayal with strategy, faced death with purpose, and even as my body withered, my will had written itself into stone. I closed my eyes and finally allowed myself rest. The battle was nearly over, but the reckoning had just begun. The morning of the funeral was gray, thick with the kind of silence that settles over a city before a storm. Church bells echoed through the narrow streets of Manhattan's Upper East Side, their slow, mournful toll announcing my supposed departure from this world. And the world responded exactly as I expected. The rich came dressed in black, the board members with folded hands and unreadable faces, the press packed across the street behind velvet ropes, cameras ready to immortalize the fall of a king. I watched none of it, of course. From a secure medical suite high above the city, flanked by 2 private physicians and monitored by Sarah's unwavering gaze, I lay in my hospital bed, alive, conscious, quiet, my pulse steady, my mind sharper than it had ever been. Only a handful of people knew the truth. Daniel Kingston had not yet drawn his last breath. But the world? The world needed to believe I had, because sometimes to win a war, you have to disappear first. I had orchestrated every minute of that funeral, the location, the guest list. Even the priest, a retired Navy chaplain I once helped fund through a veteran's startup. I wanted Lena to feel the weight of it, the velvet coffin, the orchids lining the cathedral, the stained glass light falling on her veil like divine judgment. I wanted her to hear my eulogy and wonder, with every breath she took, what I had known, and when I had known it. And judging by the reports Sarah sent back, it worked. Lena arrived in perfect mourning attire, tailored black dress, black mesh veil, pearl earrings I'd given her on our 10th anniversary, not a hair out of place. From the outside, she was the very image of a widow, poised, composed, devastated. Inside, the photos told a different story. Her hands clenched, her jaw set tight, and her eyes constantly scanning the crowd. She was waiting for someone, and he came. Hayden appeared 15 minutes into the service, slipping in quietly, taking a back pew, dressed in the sleek anonymity of an investment banker. He didn't cry. He didn't bow his head. His eyes never left Lena. Victor was watching. Sarah too. Every movement recorded, every whisper captured. But the real moment, the one I'd built toward for months, came after the service, when the mourners were escorted to the Kingston building's top-floor conference room for the reading of the will. A glass-encased room with a view of the city I built. A room that would become a courtroom. Lena took her seat at the head of the long oak table, flanked by her attorney and a junior associate from Hayden's shell firm. Hayden himself stood by the windows, pretending not to care, pretending not to be involved. But I had already written him into the script, just like her, just like everyone else. Jerome Goldstein, my estate attorney for 22 years, called the room to order. His voice was dry, emotionless, perfect for what came next. As per Mr. Kingston's instructions, he said, this proceeding will be divided into 2 parts. The formal reading of the asset distribution, followed by a final message, in Daniel's own words. That got their attention. Lena straightened slightly, her lawyer whispering something urgent. But Goldstein paid no mind. He began reading the first section, corporate holdings to trusted partners, charitable funds to foundations I had long supported, a private arts endowment in my mother's name. It was all clean, logical, indisputable. Then came the personal section. To my wife, Lena Kingston, Goldstein read, I leave a structured payment totaling $1 million to be dispersed in monthly increments over 10 years, with oversight provided by the Kingston Foundation's Ethics Committee. The room fell silent. Lena blinked slowly. Then again, as if the words hadn't made sense, she sat motionless for several seconds, then leaned to her lawyer and whispered sharply. He stood up, flustered, but Goldstein raised a hand. There is more, he said. Please remain seated. The lights dimmed, a screen descended, the video began, and there I was, alive, well, and staring directly into the camera. Gaunt, yes, pale, my voice slower than it had once been, but my eyes were the same, sharp, focused, merciless. If you're watching this, I began, then you've all come to say goodbye. And while I appreciate the theatrics, let's not pretend we're here out of love. Some of you came for answers, some for closure, and some to see what you thought you'd inherited. The camera panned slightly, zooming in on Lena's frozen face. I know what you did, I said in the video, my voice tightening. Lena, Hayden, Trevor, I know about the accounts, the meetings, the affair, the plan. You thought I was too sick, too distracted. You thought the cancer had won. Hayden turned to leave, but security blocked the door. 2 men, quiet, professional, unmovable. And you, Hayden Davis, I continued, you've made a career of taking what isn't yours. You saw an opportunity in my wife and you played her well. I'll give you that. But you failed to realize one thing. This wasn't just about money. This was about my name, my life, and I do not lose. Gasps filled the room. Some people began flipping through the thick manila folders Goldstein had distributed. Documents, wire transfers, photos. Every thread of the conspiracy laid bare. No denials. No escape. I've redirected my fortune, I said. To those who've earned it. To those who never wavered. Lena, you get your stipend. You'll survive. But you will never again touch Kingston Holdings. You will never again bear the title of partner. You made your choice, and I've made mine. The video ended. The screen went black. And Lena? She sat like a statue, hands trembling, veil now removed, exposing eyes wide with something dangerously close to fear. She tried to speak, once, twice, but her voice failed her. Finally, she stood and left, the click of her heels echoing like gunshots. Hayden followed, face pale, sweat beading along his hairline. No one stopped them. They were already finished. Later that evening, Sarah came to my hospital suite with a single line of dialogue. "It's done." I nodded. I didn't need details. I had seen it all coming. Lena would try to spin it, cry to the media, maybe sue. But the evidence was airtight. The foundation would hold firm. The board would close ranks. The empire was safe. My legacy was protected. And for the first time in months, I closed my eyes, not from fatigue but from peace. Let them say what they would, that I had died bitter, that I had gone out vengeful. They could say anything they wanted. But they'd never say I was weak. They'd never say I lost. Because even in death, I had made sure the last move was mine. In the days that followed the reading of my will, the world seemed to shift beneath Lena's feet. She had walked into that conference room thinking she'd inherited a kingdom. She walked out with a checkbook tied to a leash and a future she couldn't control. The news spread like wildfire. Financial blogs dissected the betrayal. Business analysts praised the airtight structure of the new Kingston Foundation. Pundits speculated about how a dying man managed to engineer one of the most devastating personal and corporate takedowns of the decade. But none of that mattered to me. I was back in my hospital bed, thinner, sicker, but calm. The machine still hummed. My body still ached. Yet inside, I felt stronger than I had in months, because I had taken everything they threw at me. Betrayal, illness, greed, and turned it into something immortal. Not vengeance, something more. Something untouchable. Lena, however, was unraveling. Sarah received daily updates from our quiet operatives still stationed around her life. No cameras now, no bugs, just eyes and ears. Lena had returned to the penthouse only once, and not for long. After discovering it had been retitled to a corporate asset, she packed a few bags, mostly clothes and jewelry, and checked into a mid-tier luxury apartment in Midtown, a far cry from her former life. She started making calls, lots of them, trying to secure legal standing, reaching out to former allies, old friends, lawyers, but they were ghosts now. Doors that had once opened at her smile were now locked. The whispers weren't kind. "Did you hear?" She tried to steal from him while he was dying. A con man and a corporate wife walk into a billionaire's boardroom. She became the story, not the heiress, not the victim. The cautionary tale. As for Hayden, he disappeared entirely. One of Victor's final gifts to me was a photograph. Hayden boarding a private jet using a forged passport under the name Cole Harris. No destination listed, no trace of him since. And I didn't care to find him. That part of the story was over. It was Lena I kept thinking about. Not out of love, not anymore, but out of curiosity. I wondered who she really was now that everything had been stripped away. Was there anything beneath the surface, behind the poise and pearls, besides ambition and entitlement? And then, one cold morning, I got my answer. Sarah walked in with a strange look on her face. She was holding a handwritten letter. "It's from her," she said. "Lena?" She nodded. "Courier dropped it off this morning, no return address." I took the envelope with trembling fingers and opened it slowly. Inside was a single page, carefully penned in her familiar cursive. I read it once. Then again, "Daniel, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even expect you to respond. But you should know, I never planned to destroy you. Not at first. It started as distraction, then temptation, then something else entirely. I lost track of who I was, of who we were. What you did, what you built. It was brilliant, terrifyingly brilliant. You always were. I see now that I was never part of your empire, just part of the story. I suppose I've become the cautionary chapter. I hope your final days bring peace. I hope you find something worth holding on to." No apologies, no excuses, just resignation. I set the letter down and stared out the window. The city was still there, rushing, honking, thriving, oblivious. It didn't pause for anyone, not even the dead. That same week, Sarah and I began transitioning Kingston Foundation into full operation. The board was in place, the new bylaws locked. We launched 3 major initiatives: a tech scholarship fund for underprivileged youth, a startup incubator for veteran-owned businesses, and a housing trust for terminally ill patients. It was everything I had imagined. A legacy with arms that reached farther than Lena's ambition ever could. And then, something strange happened. Sarah received a phone call from the Foundation's HR team. "You need to see this," she said, walking into my hospital suite with a laptop. She pulled up an application file. The candidate had applied for an entry-level events coordinator position. Nothing remarkable, until we saw the name, Margaret Lane. But we knew the handwriting, the voice from the interview transcript. It was Lena. "She's applying for a job?" I asked, stunned. Sarah nodded. "Under an alias, no requests for exceptions, no favors, just a real application." I stared at the screen, heart thudding. She had walked away from her old name, her old life. She was asking, without asking, for a second chance. "Do we tell the board?" Sarah asked. "No," I said. "Let her earn it, or not." A few weeks later, I asked Sarah for one more favor, something personal. "Take me to the park," I said. "Daniel, just once." She didn't argue. That's how I knew she understood what I was really asking. We arranged for private transport, a secure bench in a quiet section of Central Park. It was March, still cold, but the sun was out. The kind of sun that hints at spring but doesn't quite deliver. I sat there wrapped in a wool coat, oxygen tube in my nose, Sarah beside me. We didn't speak for a while, just listened. Birds, wind, a child laughing in the distance. And then I saw her, Lena. She was walking alone, slowly, scarf tied around her neck, hair pulled back, no makeup, no designer bag, just Lena, or whatever remained of her. She didn't see me. She sat at another bench across the path, pulled out a paperback novel and started reading. She looked tired, but focused, present. A part of me wanted to call out, to say something, to ask her if she had ever really loved me. But I didn't, because I didn't need to anymore. I'd already answered all my questions. She had tried to steal a kingdom, and I had let her walk away with a lesson instead. And maybe, just maybe, that was the greater punishment, to live with what she'd done and to find her way back, not to me, but to herself. Sarah gently touched my arm. "Ready to go?" I nodded. As we left, I didn't look back. That night, I slept without medication for the first time in weeks. My body was still weak, the doctors still cautious, but something in me had settled. The storm had passed, not outside, not in the city, inside. And for the first time in a long, long while, I let go. Spring arrived in quiet degrees. It didn't come roaring through the streets like some triumphant return. It crept into corners, softening the wind, warming the pavement, coaxing green buds from bare branches. I watched it from my hospital window like a man watching a world he no longer belonged to. And yet, strangely, I didn't feel bitter. I felt something else. Something closer to completion. Sarah visited daily. She brought reports from the foundation, photos from scholarship recipients, handwritten thank you notes from families, videos of the incubator ribbon cutting in Queens. The empire I'd once gripped so tightly in my fists was now breathing without me. And not just surviving, it was thriving. More ethical, more human, more focused than it had ever been under my watch. And somehow that felt right. As if all the pain, the betrayal, the crumbling of my body, it had meant something. Lena still worked there. Under the name Margaret Lane, she had risen carefully, quietly, never asking for promotions, never requesting access beyond her role, just showing up, every day. Organizing events, following protocols, doing the work. Sarah kept an eye on her, not out of suspicion anymore, but curiosity, maybe even hope. One afternoon, Sarah showed me a photo from a recent community event. Margaret standing in a cafeteria, hair tied back, sleeves rolled up, ladling soup into a paper bowl for a man in a tattered coat. She wasn't smiling for the camera. She didn't know one was being taken. But her face, it was unguarded, real. She looked like a person who had lost everything and was slowly building something honest from the ashes. "She's not faking it," Sarah said softly. "I know," I replied. I didn't reach out. Didn't call her in, didn't write a letter. She hadn't asked for redemption. She was earning it the only way that mattered, without permission. But that wasn't the final chapter. Not yet, because there was one last envelope left to open, one last instruction I had left sealed for Sarah, marked in my own shaky handwriting. Open only when you believe she's ready. That morning, Sarah walked into my room with tears in her eyes. "She's ready," she said. She handed me the envelope. Inside were two things, a USB drive and a short letter I had written almost a year ago, during a night when I couldn't sleep, certain I was dying, unsure if I was writing to the woman I had once loved or to a stranger. We delivered it to her anonymously. 3 days later, she appeared, not at my hospital room, not at the foundation, at the park, same bench, same time. I was waiting, wrapped in my coat, Sarah beside me. When she arrived, she didn't speak right away. She just sat on the opposite end of the bench, staring straight ahead at the pond. Ducks floated silently across the water as if time itself had slowed to accommodate us. Finally, she said, "I read it." I nodded. "I know. It was more mercy than I deserved. You earned it." She turned to look at me then, really look. And I saw what I needed to see, not guilt, not self-pity, but understanding. A woman who had fallen, broken, and gotten back up with no guarantee of forgiveness. And somehow, that made her stronger than she'd ever been. "I thought I was living a beautiful life," she said, "but really, I was just decorating a prison cell." I smiled faintly. "That's more poetic than I ever gave you credit for." She almost laughed, almost. "I was selfish, I know that. I don't expect you to forget it." "I don't need to forget," I said. "I just needed to know you'd never do it again, to anyone." She nodded slowly. "I won't." We sat in silence for a while after that. Birds chirped, a breeze moved through the budding trees, children played in the distance. It was somehow perfect. "I have one more surprise for you," I said eventually, pulling a small envelope from my coat pocket. She hesitated. "Daniel, just take it." She opened it. Inside was a check, not for millions, just enough. A down payment on a small apartment. There's a safe car, a fresh start, with her real name. "This doesn't come with strings," I said. "You've already passed the test." She stared at it for a long moment, then tucked it back into the envelope and folded it into her coat. No tears, just a quiet gratitude that said more than words ever could. As she stood to leave, she turned to me and said, "You were always the better person." "No," I said. "I was just the one who had more time to realize how short life really is." She left. No dramatic goodbye, just a hand on my shoulder. And when she disappeared down the path, I knew that was the last time I'd see her. But it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the right conclusion to a book that had gone off track and found its way back in the final pages. 2 months later, I was moved to hospice. The treatments had stopped. The machines were quieter now. Less intervention, more observation. I knew my time was almost done, and I welcomed it with calm. I'd seen the worst of people, and the best. I'd loved and lost, built and rebuilt. I had watched my body betray me while my soul fought harder than ever. And through it all, I had learned one truth above all others. What we leave behind matters more than what we take with us. Sarah visited on my final night. She brought fresh flowers, lilacs, my mother's favorite, and a book of letters from scholarship recipients who'd been told their futures were paid in full. I read them slowly, smiling at the clumsy handwriting, the hope in their words. One of them ended his letter with this: "I don't know who Mr. Kingston was, but I think he must have believed in people. That gives me hope. Maybe I'll believe in people too." That was it. That was the point. As the sun set through the narrow hospice window, casting long golden rays across the white walls, I closed my eyes and whispered a silent farewell to the city I had built, the life I had lived, the mistakes I had made, and the people I had hurt and healed along the way. I didn't die a billionaire. I didn't die a CEO. I died as Daniel Kingston, a man who once lost everything and decided that wasn't the end of the story. It was just the turning point. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this powerful story. If you're still here, it means the journey of Daniel Kingston touched something deep within you, just like it did for us. His story reminds us that even in the face of betrayal, loss, and illness, we can still choose grace, purpose, and dignity. Life will challenge us, people will disappoint us, but how we rise, how we protect what truly matters defines who we are. Daniel didn't just fight for revenge. He fought for legacy, for justice, for the kind of peace that can't be bought, only earned. And maybe that's the lesson we all need. Redemption isn't given. It's chosen, one decision at a time. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? What part of this story stayed with you the most? If this touched your heart, please consider subscribing to our channel. We share stories that go beyond entertainment, stories that inspire, challenge, and remind us of what it means to be human. Turn on the notifications, because the next story might be the one that changes how you see your own life. Thank you again. We'll see you in the next video.